Harrison, Arkansas. So, what exactly is a sundown town? In an unforgiving corner of the Arkansas Ozarks, you'll find Harrison, a small city that has become the painful, living definition of that term. Its story is a brutal and straightforward tale of ethnic cleansing, one that goes beyond subtle microaggressions or complex systemic biases. For most of its history, this was a place where Black Americans were simply not welcome after dark. And you have to understand, this policy wasn't enforced by some old law on the books. It was enforced by the chilling promise of mob violence. It all really kicked off in the early 1900s. In 1905 and then again in 1909, a series of white mob riots just systematically drove out nearly the entire Black population. Think about that. A community of over 100 African Americans was basically erased, down to just one person. The spark? Well, it was the usual story: economic anxiety. A failing railroad left people jobless and angry, and they needed someone to blame. So a white mob stormed the local jail, grabbed Black prisoners, and violently ran them out of the city. It was a wave of terror that forced Black families to flee with nothing. And it was ruthlessly effective. For almost 100 years, Harrison was kept almost exclusively white, which, as you can imagine, started to attract some of the most hateful racist organizations in the country. In recent decades, Harrison's reputation was cemented when it became the national headquarters for the Knights of the Ku Klux Klan. You'd literally see billboards with racist slogans on the highways. The town became this grim pilgrimage site for white supremacists. Now, a lot of folks in town are trying hard to shed this toxic legacy, forming task forces on race relations to heal these old wounds. But that shadow is long. Harrison stands as this stark monument to a terrifyingly simple kind of racism, using brute force to create an all-white enclave. It's a reminder that sometimes the most racist place in America isn't some sprawling city with complex problems, but a quiet little town that once decided, with fire and fury, who was allowed to call it home. How does a town like that even begin to confront its own identity? Can a place ever truly escape its past? Boston, Massachusetts. You know, there's this deeply unsettling paradox at the heart of Boston. We all think of it as the cradle of liberty, right? But the city has a history of racial intolerance so vicious, it just shatters that whole progressive reputation. Boston is the complicated face of liberal racism, a place where the fight for abolition somehow coexisted with the brutal enforcement of segregation. It's where these enlightened ideals just crashed headfirst into raw, street-level tribalism. The story of Boston is really the story of a promise of equality that was profoundly and often violently broken. And while a lot of us associate American racism with the Jim Crow South, Boston's version was potent and personal. Long before the 70s, the city's schools were deeply segregated. We're talking Black students getting way less funding than white students. And this was just the accepted norm in a city of fiercely defined ethnic neighborhoods. But then, in 1974, this simmering reality just exploded. A federal judge ruled that Boston had deliberately kept its school system segregated and ordered a citywide desegregation plan. The solution? Forced busing of students between mostly white and Black neighborhoods. The reaction was nothing short of a civic war. White working-class neighborhoods, especially in South Boston, just erupted. Mobs attacked school buses packed with Black children, throwing rocks and screaming racial slurs. It gave us one of the most disturbing photos of the 20th century. The soiling of Old Glory, where you see a white protester attacking a Black lawyer with an American flag. It was a level of hatred that just blew up the myth of Northern racial enlightenment. Even basketball legend Bill Russell called Boston a flea market of racism. And today, that legacy persists. It's this haunting reminder that racism isn't confined to one region or ideology. It can fester and erupt anywhere. But while Boston's racism hides behind that progressive mask, some towns are forced to wear a scar, a single horrific event that defines them forever. And later in our journey, we're going to travel to a small town in Mississippi where the ghosts of 3 young men still haunt the collective American memory. Cicero, Illinois. Just west of Chicago, there's a town whose name you might know for organized crime, Cicero, Illinois. It was Al Capone's infamous headquarters, sure, but its darkest legacy has little to do with bootlegging and gangsters. Instead, it's a story of a ferocious, multi-generational commitment to racial segregation, enforced with relentless violence. Cicero's history is just this raw exhibition of how northern, working-class communities used mob rule to stay all white with a ferocity that could rival any Klan rally in the Deep South. The moment that really defined Cicero's racial history went down in the summer of 1951. A Black Air Force veteran named Harvey Clark Jr. and his family rented an apartment in the all-white town. They were just looking for a better life. The moment they tried to move in, the police met them and told Clark to get out of town or he'd get a bullet through him. The NAACP had to get involved, and a court ordered the police to protect the family. So they finally moved their stuff in. What happened next was one of the most violent race riots in American history. A mob of over 4,000 white residents swarmed the apartment building. They looted the Clarks' things, threw their furniture out the windows, and set the place on fire. It raged for 3 days. The governor had to call in the National Guard, and the aftermath? It was just as shocking. Instead of indicting the rioters, a grand jury charged the Clarks' lawyer and the landlady who rented them the apartment with conspiring to incite the riot, just for trying to integrate the town. That was the Cicero way. For decades, any attempt at integration was met with arson, bombings, and mob intimidation. It was a brutally enforced social contract. It just goes to show you how northern communities defended their white identity, with bricks, firebombs, and a police force that looked the other way. That kind of overt violence is one way to enforce segregation, for sure. But sometimes, the lines that divide us aren't drawn by mobs. They're drawn on maps. Click subscribe to help us keep unfolding these complex maps. Milwaukee, Wisconsin. There's a cold, statistical brutality to the racism that defines Milwaukee, Wisconsin. For decades, study after study has come back with the same grim verdict. Milwaukee is one of America's most, and often the architecture of Milwaukee's segregation was really built back in the 1930s with redlining. Federal surveyors drew these maps of the city and color-coded neighborhoods to assess mortgage lending risk. And guess what? Every single neighborhood with black residents was colored red, marked hazardous for investment. That official policy, combined with rules that flat out forbade homeowners from selling to black families, effectively trapped African Americans in a small, deteriorating section of the city's north side. So while white families were getting federally backed loans to move to the suburbs, black families were stuck. It created this cycle of concentrated poverty that's still there today. The consequences are just stark. In modern Milwaukee, a black resident is more likely to live in a poor neighborhood than anywhere else in the country. The city has some of the nation's biggest racial gaps in income, education, and incarceration. Here's a crazy statistic for you. Over half of black men in their 30s and 40s in Milwaukee County have been incarcerated. There's a bridge in the city that was historically called the longest bridge in the world because it connected the black north side to the white south side, Poland to Africa. And even now, the city is so divided that over 80% of black residents would have to move just to create integrated neighborhoods. This is how systemic racism operates, through the quiet, bureaucratic efficiency of deeds, loans, and zoning laws, rather than through angry mobs. We've seen racism as overt hate, as liberal hypocrisy, and as violent exclusion. But what happens when racism isn't just a feature of a city, but the very engine of its economy and systems, operating on a scale so vast it becomes almost invisible? New York. We all know New York City as the melting pot of the world, right? This glittering metropolis celebrated for its diversity. But underneath that shiny surface is a system of racial inequality so vast and sophisticated that it makes the city a huge paradox. It's somehow one of the most diverse and one of the most segregated places on Earth. You won't find the racism of New York in Sundown signs. You'll find it in spreadsheets, police databases, and school enrollment statistics, operating on a scale that affects millions. For years, the city's main tool for this was the NYPD's stop and frisk policy. At its peak in 2011, the NYPD made almost 700,000 stops in a single year. It's just a staggering number, and the racial disparities were breathtaking. Over 80% of those stopped were Black and Latino, even though they were just over half the city's population. Young Black men were getting stopped constantly, often for doing absolutely nothing. The official reason was to get illegal weapons off the street, but nearly 90% of the stops led to nothing. It was basically an engine of harassment and racial profiling, and this inequality goes way deeper. New York City's public schools are among the most segregated in the entire country. We're talking more segregated than a lot of places in the Deep South. It's a direct result of the city's housing patterns, where your zip code basically decides your kid's future. Generations of discriminatory housing policies, some of them designed by infamous figures like Robert Moses, deliberately walled off communities of color. New York's story is this powerful, uncomfortable lesson. A city can welcome the entire world through its harbor while running a sophisticated, data-driven machine of racial subordination. If this can happen in our most diverse city, it forces us to see that the American story of race is so much broader than just the black-white binary. Yuba County, California. Out in the quiet farmland of Northern California, Yuba County holds a mostly forgotten story of American racism, one that took aim at the Chinese immigrants who helped build the American West. Its largest city, Marysville, once had one of the biggest Chinatowns in the country. It was this bustling hub for thousands of miners and laborers during the gold rush. But this pioneering community became the flashpoint for a violent, xenophobic movement that shows you a foundational prejudice in the California dream. It proves that the roots of American racism are tragically diverse. The Chinese came to California in the 1850s looking for their fortune in what they called Gold Mountain, and they were crucial. They built the railroads, worked the mines. By 1870, a third of Marysville's population was Chinese. But as the gold rush started to fade and jobs got competitive, white resentment just curdled into pure hatred. You had politicians and labor unions pushing the slogan, "The Chinese must go," stoking fears that foreign laborers were stealing jobs and corrupting America. This kind of talk fueled a wave of terror. Chinatowns across the West were burned down, and their residents were lynched or run out of town by mobs. Marysville's Chinatown essentially became a fortress, a place of refuge. But soon, the anti-Chinese movement became official government policy. California passed laws specifically to punish Chinese miners, and then the federal government passed the 1882 Chinese Exclusion Act, the first law in American history to ban immigration based on nationality alone. Yuba County was right at the heart of all this. It was a place where the promise of the West was violently denied to an entire group of people just because of where they came from. It's such a crucial chapter in this story, a powerful reminder that the struggle for inclusion has been fought on so many different fronts, against so many different kinds of hate. And this history of excluding the other isn't confined to the past. It has evolved and embedded itself in the very fabric of our modern perfect communities. Allen, Texas. In the sprawling, affluent suburbs north of Dallas, the city of Allen, Texas, represents the new frontier of American racial tension. Allen is a modern master-planned community of manicured lawns, mega churches, and high-achieving schools. It doesn't have a notorious history of riots or a legacy of Jim Crow. It's a picture of 21st century suburban success, and yet, it's right here, in this landscape of rapid growth, that a more contemporary, insidious form of racism has taken root. It shows us that white flight and segregation haven't disappeared. They've just evolved. Allen's story is really one of dramatic demographic change. It used to be a mostly white exurb, but in the last couple of decades, it's become incredibly diverse, attracting thousands of Black, Hispanic, and Asian families. But this growing diversity has been met with a quiet, and sometimes not so quiet, backlash. It all came to a head in a series of incidents that exposed the ugly underbelly of this suburban ideal. The most searing case involved a Black middle schooler who was subjected to just relentless racist bullying. He was called slurs, and his classmates even held a mock slave auction in a group chat to sell him. When his mother went to the school for help, she was met with inaction. This bureaucratic indifference that treated profound racial trauma like it was a minor issue. And this wasn't an isolated event. You had other incidents across the district, slurs scrawled on bathroom walls, Confederate flags at school events. It painted a picture of a community that was really failing to adapt to its new identity. The racism in Allen functions differently from systemic tools like redlining or stop and frisk. It's the racism of 1,000 daily cuts, of cultural clashes in the cafeteria, of coded language at homeowner meetings. This is a powerful illustration that the story of American racism is now also a story of new tensions in new places, erupting at the heart of the modern American dream. It's a sobering reminder that new paint and manicured lawns can't conceal the old foundational cracks in a society that still hasn't truly reckoned with its biggest sins. Philadelphia, Mississippi. Our journey ends here, on a quiet county road in the heart of Mississippi, in a small town whose name is forever stained with the blood of the civil rights movement. Philadelphia. This isn't a place of sprawling systemic racism or subtle prejudice. Instead, it is the epicenter of a single monstrous act of racist violence, an event so brutal it shocked the conscience of a nation and became a symbol of the immense human cost of hatred. The story of Philadelphia, Mississippi, is really the story of America's heart of darkness and the agonizingly slow crawl towards the light. It was the summer of 1964, Freedom Summer. 3 young civil rights workers, James Chaney, a Black man from Mississippi, and Andrew Goodman and Michael Schwerner, 2 white men from New York, were working to register Black voters. On June 21st, the local deputy sheriff, who was a Klansman, arrested them. He held them for hours and then released them into the night, directly into a Klan ambush he had helped set up. The 3 young men were chased down, beaten, and shot to death. Their bodies were buried in an earthen dam. For 44 days, their disappearance was a mystery that gripped the world. When the FBI found their bodies, it laid bare the absolute savagery of the state's resistance to equality. But for decades, there was no justice. A few Klansmen were convicted on federal charges, but no one was ever tried for murder by the state of Mississippi. The town of Philadelphia just lived under this cloud of silence, its name synonymous with this infamous crime. It wasn't until 2005, 41 years after the killings, that the state finally prosecuted the ringleader, an 80-year-old Klansman named Edgar Ray Killen, and convicted him of manslaughter. That trial was a watershed moment. It was a painful but necessary reckoning for a community that had hidden from its own history for so long. The story of Philadelphia, Mississippi, is ultimately the story of America, a place of profound darkness and a flickering, defiant hope, forever wrestling with the question of what it means to be whole.